Welcome to Witching Hours. I'm Regina, otherwise known as the Crone Witch Hazel, and I welcome you to come and sit with us for a spell. I'm so delighted to be joined this evening by Dr. Michael Mauk, who I'll be referring to as Mike the rest of the show, who is a professor of neuroscience at the College of Natural Sciences of the University of Texas in Austin. And he is also the host of an ongoing series of conversations for the public known as UT Brainstorms. So welcome, Mike. And I'd like you to say anything you'd like to about yourself, but specifically if you could share with our viewers a little bit more about UT Brainstorms.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. Brainstorms is just the University of Texas, well, the Department of Neurosciences effort to reach out to non-scientists, mostly in the Austin area, and just share things that we know about neuroscience. We have this sensitive, as a neuroscientist, if you can't make neuroscience interesting to people, you should maybe find a new job. So neuroscience is a very personal science. It's about us and our minds. And so people find that fascinating, and we want to share. We called it a conversation because we also learn so much from the questions that we get in interacting with people. It's why the Zoom format is a little unsatisfying, but we hope to get back to our old format at the LBJ Auditorium. But we hope that people learn from us. We learn from the people who attend. We make connections, and it's just something that we felt that a world-class neuroscience department ought to do.
So it's really open to the general public. And I guess my next question, because I am definitely not a scientist, is there any such thing as a stupid question?
There are stupid questions. They're rare. Most of the time when people feel like they're asking a stupid question, they're just being self-conscious. So, but any professor at a major university knows that there are indeed stupid questions. But we get very few of them at UT Brainstorms. Actually, to be honest, I have always been impressed by the quality of the questions that the people ask. And it's natural to be self-conscious. People feel like that, oh, this is so much of this is over my head and this and that. But one of our goals is to not make it over everybody's head. And so sometimes it's the way people ask a question that makes us realize, oh, we weren't clear, we were too technical. And yes. So just like in a classroom where sometimes the professor learns as much from the question as the answer informs the student.
Well, that's a good teacher.
Right. And so yeah, there are stupid questions, but they're rare.
I'm sure I'll find some of them today.
Doubtful.
But if someone wanted to just test the waters before, as you say, right now it has to be virtual before they can go back to actually seeing you in person. There are, I think, are there 24 already of these sessions that have been recorded? You can go to YouTube, is that correct? And
that's right. We have our own YouTube channel, UT Brainstorms, and I don't remember the exact number. I think we didn't record the first 3 or 4. And then a year ago, we got a little donation so that we could hire a videographer who does a nicer job. And so if you watch a bunch of them, you'll notice the jump in quality there. Of course, now that we're doing them electronically, then we record them, and so you see the same thing that you would see if you'd sat at your computer.
And so you have specific topics. So for example, I noticed one of them was Alzheimer's. So if someone, I mean, you talk about the physical brain, and when we think about thoughts, when we think about like people's worries about brain or mental health, or whether it's PTSD or Alzheimer's or a very well-balanced mind, we're not always sure, is this purely physical? Do emotions come into play? How much is psychological? But say, for example, with Alzheimer's, how would you discuss something like that?
Yeah, so there's a long history of this what's psychological, what's physical, what's the connection between our minds and our bodies.
Yeah.
Neuroscience teaches us that it's hard to grasp, and we certainly don't understand. We don't have an equation that makes it clear why this would be so, but our minds come from our brains. And so if there's some issue with our mind, something's happening in our brain. Maybe we would think of it as psychological because it came from a set of experiences, but it's still your mind and the way that it's wired up and the way that it functions that responds to those series of events. But something like Alzheimer's disease is much more straightforward, unambiguous. Alzheimer's disease, neurons are dying. And as they die, the normal functioning of the parts of the brain where that death is happening deteriorate. And so there's no reason to invoke psychology. Certainly we see effects on mind and behavior, but most neurological disorders, Parkinson's disease, that's a death of a particular kinds of neurons, ALS, another one where a different class of neurons is dying. But often with neurological disorders, unfortunately, it involves neurons dying. And as they die, the things that they did go away.
Good.
And so then we experience the loss of whatever cognitive function we have. Now, there are some neurological disorders like, say, epilepsy, where neurons aren't necessarily dying, but they're misbehaving, they're firing, their activity is abnormal. Even so, we wouldn't think of an epileptic seizure as psychology.
No.
It's
thanks. Most people can grasp that. You think of epilepsy as physical.
It's neurons misbehaving and being active in unusual and unproductively large ways. So.
And now this year, you already had one or two conversations about COVID itself.
We just thought, starting in the summertime, we just thought that it would make sense that somehow, some way, that every brainstorms would touch on something about current events in COVID. So we had one that had nothing to do with the brain. One of our colleagues, Dan Leahy from the Molecular Biosciences Department in here, UT, gave a brilliant brainstorms on viruses and the histories of vaccines. Which of course was relevant. We've had several about stress and the effects of stress on learning because the relevance of that is obvious. The one coming up in November, one of our neurologists from the Dell Medical School at UT is going to talk to us about neurological implications that can happen from COVID infection. And so whether it's the effects of stress on learning to vaccines to everything in between, we just thought a useful thing that we could do would be to make them relevant to current challenges.
Absolutely. Everyone is thinking about it, but I think too many feel they don't know where to go. They don't know where to turn to deal with the stress that they're under and anxiety. Yeah. And in your observations, have you noticed anything unique about the general public's symptoms, if you will? Are there symptoms that you've noticed during COVID-19, whether it be stress or anxiety, and behaviors that are a result of that you haven't noticed before in a general way?
I mean, I would keep in mind that those of us in the neuroscience department, we're not physicians, so we're scientists, and so certainly we have our colleagues over at the med school in the neurology department, and we talk to them, and the brainstorms in November again is gonna be about that. And I know some of the punchlines from that presentation because I've spoken to people. So there are some neurological issues. One of the obvious ones is there's a much higher risk of stroke in people that are infected with the coronavirus. You'll hear about the other ones from our colleague Esther Melamed when she speaks. I think everybody understands that chronic stress is tough on us. We did it, the last brainstorms we did, we talked about how that can affect learning and memory. Of course, what everybody wants to know is what I can do about it. And as a neuroscientist, I'm not an expert on how to relieve stress. People ask questions. I said, I don't know. I try to exercise and have only one beer at night. So
but even
we're doing.
that is helpful. Recently, I spoke to someone from, again, UT Austin, but the Anxiety and Stress Clinic.
Right.
And right now, they're offering up to 3 free sessions. They're virtual, of course, but one-on-one, just to talk about some of the symptoms that they're observing on the psychological basis.
Yeah.
And, different solutions or things people might try. As you mentioned, exercise, that's right up there. I mean, exercise is very important. But when you're speaking about it from a physical standpoint. And when you mentioned stroke, because I've been reading more and more, they say that the COVID-19, there seem to be cases where it does affect the brain in a physical way.
Yeah.
And I'm not up to what exactly those things are, but when you mentioned stroke, would that have something to do with circulation?
Well, I think this isn't my area, but I've tried to inform myself on this. One of the things that's clear about the coronavirus infection is that it causes an inflammation response, and so this can affect different organs in different ways. Certainly, we know about the ways that it can affect the lungs and the problems that can cause with breathing and such. But it can affect the blood vessels. Inflammation there can cause problems, and neurons are cells, just like the brain is an organ, just like other organs, and so it's not immune to inflammation. And then there are some bad things that can happen when the brain, when neurons experience inflammation. And so this is a lot of what Dr. Melamed is going to talk about in a couple of weeks on our next brainstorms.
That's at your UT brainstorms.
That's right.
And when exactly is that?
I was afraid you're going to ask. Give me a second.
Oh.
I think
But
November. I want to say November 12th.
12th. Oh, okay.
Thursday, November 12th at 7 p.m.
But once that takes place, you record this, and then we'll be able to find it on YouTube or elsewhere.
Yeah. So the value of experiencing it live is that in that format, we've found that the best way to deal with questions is people just type in the questions in the chat in the YouTube chat. We have a way of funneling them and filtering them and getting them to our panelists, and then the panelists can answer them. We've even had a little bit of feedback from people, some shyer people, that they kind of like this format because it was easier for them to be brave enough to ask the question. We've had brainstorms at the LBJ auditorium where they had 900 people.
Yeah, and, it's a little intimidating to ask a question.
It's not always easy to stand up to a microphone and hear your own voice and say a question out loud that you're a little nervous about asking, and then plus there's 900 people listening. So the value of attending them live is you have the opportunity for questions. Now, having said that, one of the things that we always stress in brainstorms is that there's never enough time for all the questions.
Yeah.
And every single brainstorms we've ever had, we've had to stop because the clock told us to. We didn't stop because the people ran out of questions to ask. And so I always tell them, I always make my email address available. And I tell people, if you didn't get your question answered, or if you think of another one driving home, this is not uncommon, or people drive home and they're talking in the car and they go, well, why didn't you ask that? So whatever, if it occurs to you 3 days later, email me. And then if what I try to tell people is that if I can't answer the question, I'll find somebody who can.
Oh, well, and that's great. Now, is that something they could also do on YouTube? Like once the event has already taken place, could they actually post questions, or is that not monitored?
No, so when we do our YouTube events, when the speaker's done speaking, then we have our panel of 2 or 3 additional faculty. And for the next 45 minutes or so, people type in questions to the YouTube chat, and then the panelists answer them. But again, if you typed in something that didn't get answered or thought of something later, whether it's our live events or these virtual electronic events, everybody's welcome to email us questions for later. Again, part of what's in this for us is that we meet people, we hear these questions. The nature of these questions informs us about things we should be thinking about, things that people are worried about. And sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in bigger ways, we're informed and at the very least inspired by these interactions. So we do everything we can to interact with people if they want to or need to.
Well, it's a tremendous service. And if some high school students watch this, it might give them an idea. I mean, this is a form of science that a lot of people may not even be aware of. And students who are looking into careers may see something that, you know, they didn't even consider, but something to then look into. And if so, is that, I mean, you know, even the students and applying to colleges now seems to be affected by COVID.
Yeah.
The choice, like, do you apply to a college, even if you're going to be studying virtually, or, you know, or do you maybe take the chance and go to the campus and see what happens? But if this is an area, I should ask, what areas were you really concentrating on and researching before COVID hit? And has that actually affected your research?
Yeah, well, let me go back to the student thing for a second, because it's a thing that I like to talk about. So we you know, we love all of our audience members at Brainstorms, but it's particularly satisfying for us when younger people show up in the high school and middle age, and they're surprisingly savvy. You know, 20 years ago, if you asked a college freshman neuroscience major, why are you majoring in neuroscience? It was usually, well, you know, I was inspired by the fact my grandma had Alzheimer's or Park or something like that. Now there's all these podcasts and things that kids that age know a lot about neuroscience. There were all sorts of fun classic anecdotes that somebody like me could tell in Neuroscience 1. Well, they know them all now. They're bored with those. So, and we love helping inform that age group of people. And, you know, neuroscience is the fastest growing major at UT. So
now,
there
do
seems
you
to
have
be
any
no,
insight as to why that is? I mean, it's fascinating. Maybe it's your UT brainstorms that are making it available.
Yeah, well, that would be nice. It started before then. It was before Brainstorms, but no, you know, it's one path to medical school, so that's part of it. But it's all, so it has this dual personality that it can be a path to medical school. It can also be a path to science, and and it's a science that scientific discipline that even later you decide you're not going to be a neuroscientist, that your training was valuable for in many other arenas as well. So kids, you know, high school age kids find it as fascinating as we do. And so
well, it is fascinating. And in some ways, I do think that current day high schoolers are much more aware and much more open about talking about, I'm trying to find another word besides mental health, but just the existence of the mental processes. And when you describe your research, you know, it sounds very physical as opposed to, say, psychological. But when you're dealing with depression, or you're dealing with headaches or PTSD, or, you know, these symptoms of COVID, you're talking about very specific physical differences. And it seems that they're pretty savvy about that, and perhaps very specifically on areas they might like to research.
I think so. I mean, I have two daughters. One's a freshman in college, one's a senior in high school. So they're going through these things like you mentioned. We, as a family, have experienced some of the things on that list that you just mentioned. So, and I know that my daughter's friends have struggled with some of them, some issues. And so we tend as a society to sweep these things under the rug less than we used to, which means that we empower our kids to deal with them better when they experience it. And so, yeah, I think just compared to our generation, they are quite a bit more savvy and no, but that's the purpose. We would hope that their kids are more savvy and informed than they are.
Right. Well, the more information that is released, the more, and the less of an onus is on the very like discussion of mental illness. Like I think in my own family, like the generation before, you would avoid at all costs going to any kind of therapist because it would be considered a sign of weakness. Now it's almost just the opposite. It's, all right, I know something is wrong. I'm going to get to the bottom of it. And that's extremely empowering. But, you know, when you say, oh, you see things in your own family, you see things in your daughter's friend's family, I think every single family has some issue, one or another. And it's the ignorance that becomes, I think, the real challenge.
Right. And of course, COVID makes all of this, amplifies it, and makes it more pertinent. So all the more.
I wonder, does COVID make speaking about mental health much more socially acceptable, because its effects are universal, and virtually everyone I've spoken to says that they feel anxiety as a result of COVID, and that's a mental health issue.
Yeah.
So has this forced it into the mainstream?
Well, if I don't know, maybe there are some silver linings in this craziness. I mean, it's always nice to look for the better things. My daughters now are suddenly best friends. They've been forced to be together more, and so we can go find ways to find positives inside this bigger negative. But awareness and openness about these things is always makes it easier to deal with them, no question.
And then we mentioned these other issues too, whether it's PTSD or headaches. I think is very big. Most people have experienced some form of headache, and it's definitely physical. Are these areas, like each one specifically, areas of interest in the College of Natural Sciences? And well, memory and learning, I believe, is part of your specialty. That can be segmented somehow and studied individually. And is that what some of your different faculty do?
Sort of. So the thing about the biological sciences is that, and neuroscience being one of them, a category, most of us are what we in the category that we would call basic scientists, which means, among other things, that we aren't focused in particular on one disease or problem. We're just trying to understand. So for example, there's one part of the brain that I specialize in, and I've spent my entire career just trying to understand how it works. Right? And so it wouldn't be fair to say precisely that my research is about finding ways to prevent diseases of that part of the brain or cures for problems. But one of the main reasons we all do this kind of work is that it provides the foundation so that we can. So the metaphor that I like is think of the metaphor would be as a car is like our body. And so cars break down just like our bodies have problems. And imagine car mechanics who had no idea how cars work. They could stumble on some things, they could have some superstitions. Maybe somebody a long time ago realized that when the tires are oval, that you could put air in them and it gets better. But the first thing that any car mechanic learns to become a good mechanic is how cars work, how they work when they're not broken. And then that provides the foundation to understand how they break, what it looks like when they break, and how you fix them. And so think of basic scientists as people who are providing that foundation. How do our bodies work? How do our brains work? And it often requires us to focus in on particular things, so much so that it's just not true to say, well, I'm trying to cure diseases of this part of the brain.
I see.
But the underlying idea is very much about that. I'm providing a foundation so that the more we understand how the brain works normally, the better prepared and enabled we are to understand how it breaks and how to fix it. So
I see. And now in your UT brainstorms, you seem to invite colleagues from different disciplines. You just mentioned Dell Medical School,
right,
and other parts of the university. Is that unique to UT brainstorms, or do you also have some collaborations with some of the different disciplines in your work?
So yeah, I have a couple answers to that question. One is that neuroscience is a quite broad field. And so there are people here at UT who are, say, in a computer science department or a molecular biology department or biomedical engineering, and yet in some way their research relates to the brain or neural function. And so we're unashamed about asking those colleagues who aren't in the Department of Neuroscience to speak, because the topic will be pertinent no matter what. We've expanded a little bit in the COVID phase. My colleague and friend Dan Lee, he, like I said, did a wonderful job with his brainstorms about viruses and vaccines. When we invite people from Del Med, they're physician scientists who work on the brain, so they're cousins, and it makes perfect sense to ask them as well. The other thing I'll say is that I think the successes of brainstorms has caught people's eye here. I know the dean of the College of Natural Sciences, Paul Goldbart, has expressed interest in sort of expanding brainstorms to either expanding brainstorms to include more topics or to add things from other departments that look kind of like brainstorms, and some of those exist. But I think it's made everybody realize more than we did before that there's an appetite out there for things that scientists do. Even if you just search utbrainstorms.com, that takes you. We bought that URL, so if you just type UT Brainstorms, it'll take you to our site.
Oh, how great! Oh,
and then from there you can find links to the ones we've recorded. You can go to YouTube and go to our YouTube channel and do the same thing. I would recommend actually to go to our utbrainstorms.com site, because they're lined up. You can see all of the titles, and I think it's easier to sort of peruse one that might interest you by going there, because they're just kind of laid out in a simpler format.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much. And this is actually something some of us have a bit of time to do right now at home. But just to whet the appetite and to really to enter that conversation is so useful. And I'm so sorry, Mike, I have to cut us off now. I could listen forever. Well, once we're done, I can just go over to YouTube and listen to you talk a bit more.
There you go.
But thank you so much for joining me today on Witching Hours. And I'll bid good evening to our viewers. And I think we're just so lucky to have this unbelievable resource right here in our community. Again, this is Regina from Witching Hours, bidding you all good night.